Next, I'm going to talk about the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it extends from the foramen magnum of the skull all the way down the vertebral column up until just about the second lumbar vertebra. So the spinal cord doesn't actually go down the entire vertebral column. It actually ends about the second lumbar vertebra. And the main function of the spinal cord is basically to act as a highway for information flow to the brain and then down from the brain. Okay. Coming off the spinal cord, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are not part of the spinal cord. They're considered part of the peripheral nervous system, right? But we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, so that's 62 altogether. And each is connected to the spinal cord through structures called nerve roots. So each spinal nerve has a dorsal root and a ventral root located on the corresponding sides. While I'm talking about spinal nerves, I wanted to mention what we find in a spinal nerve. So we've talked about nerves in this class before, but nerves are basically bundles of axons. And axons are carrying signals from one place to another. So that's the main function of a spinal nerve, is to carry a signal from one place to another. In the picture on the left here, we can see the different spinal nerves and then the areas of the body that they're controlling. Now let's take a look at the spinal cord itself. Right? When we look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, we notice that there is this darker matter towards the center and then this white matter towards the outside. Right? So that would be gray matter and white matter. The internal gray matter is composed mostly of neuron cell bodies, as all gray matter is, and these cell bodies are receiving incoming sensory information and sending out outgoing motor commands. And when we look at the gray matter, we can see that there are different sections to it. We have the dorsal horns of the gray matter located towards the back of the spinal cord, the ventral horns of gray matter located towards the anterior or front of the spinal cord, and then in some areas of the spinal cord there are lateral horns which are located between the dorsal and the ventral gray areas. In the very, very center of the spinal cord, we find the central canal, which is a pin-sized hole that contains cerebral spinal fluid. Now looking at the white matter of the spinal cord, the white matter of the spinal cord is composed of myelinated axons. And these myelinated axons, like any axon, is carrying a signal. So basically the white matter is really just conduction routes to send signals up and down the spinal cord. Like the gray matter, we had dorsal, lateral, and ventral areas. We see this also with the white matter. We call these columns and not horns. So we have dorsal columns towards the back, ventral columns towards the front, and then lateral columns to the right and left sides. The white matter of the spinal cord is carrying signals either towards the brain or away from the brain. Tracks of white matter in the spinal cord that are sending signals towards the brain are called sensory or afferent tracks. They're called sensory because they're carrying sensory information up to the brain. Afferent means to go towards the center, in this case towards the brain. And then we have motor tracks in the white matter, and motor tracks are carrying nerve impulses from the brain and then eventually towards the skeletal muscle. These are also called efferent tracks because efferent means to go away from the center. I mentioned the meninges when we were talking about the brain. I said the meninges are sheet-like structures that cover both the brain and the spinal cord. I did want to talk a little bit more about the meninges and the spinal cord because the spinal cord does have a couple differences. And these differences are clinically significant. So first up, I wanted to mention something called an epidural space that we find associated with the meninges of the spinal cord. The epidural space is a space that's located between the dura mater and the vertebrae, the bones of the vertebral column. This epidural space is usually packed full of fat in the body, but it's of clinical significance because it is used as a site for anesthetic injections. So maybe you've heard of a woman who is giving birth getting an epidural. So in this case, an anesthetic is injected into the epidural space that causes a numbing of the body below the hips. Another structure of the meninges of the spinal cord that is clinically significant is the subarachnoid space. So if you recall, the subarachnoid space contains cerebrospinal fluid, and this is true in both the brain and the spinal cord. At the level of the spinal cord, we can actually withdraw cerebrospinal fluid from the subarachnoid space, and this is called a lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. The lumbar puncture or spinal tap might be done in order to check cerebrospinal fluid for certain components that could be indicative of certain diseases, such as brain cancer, for example. Both of these procedures, the epidural and the lumbar puncture, are normally performed inferior to lumbar vertebra number 2. And this is in order to prevent damage to the spinal cord, because if you recall, I said the spinal cord ends at around L2. And these procedures are done basically blind. You can't see where the needle is going. So should the needle penetrate too far inward, you won't be damaging the spinal cord if you go in below L2. Next up is the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is also known as our involuntary nervous system. Some people like to call this the automatic nervous system because it handles those parts of our body that are involuntary, or what we think of as automatic. Automatic isn't really the right term, but it's okay to use it in this case. So the involuntary nervous system is controlling things that we don't consciously control, like our heart rate and our respiratory rate most of the time, and our digestive system, and most of our urinary system. Okay? So the autonomic nervous system is really mostly composed of spinal and cranial nerves that are reaching out to these involuntary organs. The autonomic nervous system is controlled by the central nervous system. If you recall, the medulla oblongata and the hypothalamus and even the pons all contain autonomic control centers that are going to be controlling these activities. But the autonomic nervous system itself is composed of cranial and spinal nerves reaching out to these involuntary organs. There are two main subdivisions to the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is also known as our fight or flight division. And that's because this is our emergency nervous system, and it helps us to get our body ready for fighting off a threat or flight, running away from a threat. So it will increase your heart rate and increase your respiratory rate and increase blood flow to your skeletal muscles. Okay? It will decrease digestive system activity. Because if you think about it, when you're in an emergency situation, that's a bad time to digest the double cheeseburger in your stomach. So we're going to turn off the digestive system, but turn up almost all other body systems with the sympathetic response. Okay. So in this picture here, you can see that flight is happening, right? So this individual is being chased by a black bear. So we are under emergency sympathetic response right now. So the hypothalamus is one of the parts of our brain that controls this autonomic response. So the hypothalamus here is activating the sympathetic division of our nervous system, which is going to cause an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, an increase in respiratory rate. The sympathetic nervous system will also stimulate the adrenal glands to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine, which we also know as the hormone adrenaline, which is also going to increase the heart rate and increase the respiratory rate and increase our blood pressure. Blood flow to the skeletal muscles is increased, so those muscles can be used to run away from the threat. But stomach contractions and the digestive system is inhibited here. Now with the parasympathetic division, this is your rest and digest division, right? Because this is the part of your autonomic system that is controlling your involuntary organs most of the time, which is when you're resting, right? So hopefully you're not mostly in emergency mode. Hopefully most of the time you are in resting mode and your parasympathetic division is in control. So the parasympathetic division is like a parachute. It slows down most of your involuntary body activities, with the exception of digestion. So the parasympathetic nervous system lowers your heart rate to a resting rate. It lowers your blood pressure to a resting blood pressure. It lowers your respiratory rate to a resting respiratory rate. But it increases digestive system activities, because when you're resting, that's a good time to digest your food. And most of this is done through just one nerve, actually, one cranial nerve called the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, vagus means wanderer. The vagus nerve kind of wanders all over your involuntary organs and sends signals to them, telling them to slow down, with the exception of the digestive organs, which it says speed up. So in this picture here, you can see what hopefully looks like something that's not emergency mode, right? So all of these people have their parasympathetic division regulating their involuntary body activities right now. They have a resting heart rate, a resting respiratory rate, decreased blood flow to the skeletal muscles because they're not running away from a black bear, right? Increased blood flow to their digestive organs, right? You can see they're eating their meal, so they're going to need to start digesting that, and which also will mean that the parasympathetic division will send increased muscle contractions to their digestive system.